Here you go.
All right. So as mentioned before, we're going to be providing a overview on the 2022 CVFPP update, where we are with, we produced a working draft and we're working towards the public draft. And then Heidi will be jumping in after my presentation to talk to you about the 2022 conservation strategy update and some of the multi-benefit efforts, planning efforts that are being done in conjunction and parallel with that effort. So if you can go next slide. And one more slide, please. So the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan builds on significant scientific and collaborative work over the past 15 years. It is a strategic framework for managing of flood management resources in the Central Valley, in particular within the confines or the areas protected by the state plan of flood control facilities. The effort aligns with California's Water Resilience Portfolio Initiative and includes a commitment to protect and enhance natural systems. The conservation strategy supports all of the CVFPP goals, and but focuses specifically on promoting ecosystem functions and initiatives. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is a descriptive document. It's not intended to be a funding or permitting decision for specific projects, more of that strategic overall look with the portfolio of management actions that can be achieved to help manage floods within the Central Valley. It also prioritizes the state's investment in flood management over the next 3 decades. And as we go through, that is at the 30 years is a rolling 30-year planning horizon. It promotes multi-benefit projects. We look at the way flood management can interact with the other parts of the water management system, including ecosystem, including some of the other water sectors, such as groundwater recharge and those types of efforts. It also integrates and improves ecosystem functions associated with flood risk reduction projects. Next slide, please. So just gives you an idea of the kind of the overall kind of path that the CVFPP has gone on. It started in 2007 with the SB 5, which at that time mandated that the department prepare and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board adopt a flood management plan for the Central Valley in 2012. It also mandated that on the 7s and 2s every 5 years, on years ending in 7s and 2s, that we similarly, the department prepare and the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, or Central Valley Flood Protection Board, excuse me, adopt an update. And so in 2012, we prepared the plan, in which helped define what we call the state system-wide investment approach, which was the approach to how we can manage floods in the Central Valley. 2017, we refined that SSIA mainly through the portfolio development, and then looked at other foundational themes and developed policy issues that become impediments to the implementation, those sort of things. And now we're in the 2022 cycle, which we'll again look at the portfolio of management actions that are out there, refine those, and then look at 3 themes that we're focusing on within this plan, which are climate resilience, performance tracking, and alignment with other state efforts. And then just that 2027 is something that we'll be working on as we complete the 2022 plan this year. Next slide, please. So being a 5-year planning cycle, the intent with each 5-year planning cycle is to go through a similar process each time. As I mentioned, we are going through and assessing the SSIA portfolio to see what's been completed, what still needs to be completed, where are there some refinements from the local stakeholders as to what some of those management actions are in their particular regions. So we gather information from all the locals and the various entities. We go through a process of screening out ones that may not be consistent with the state system-wide investment approach, and then come up with a portfolio of actions that are moved forward as kind of consistent with the state system-wide investment approach. And then we take that information and we're also developing policy recommendations. What are those policy impediments that are getting in the way of us being able to speed up our pace of implementation, getting in the way of us being able to get more funding for the work that we need to do? And then looking at ways to track progress of performance across what we're calling a set of societal values. And those are indicated by those the logos on the screen, the icons on the screen. So we've got public safety, we've got the ecosystem, we've got a healthy economy, We got what we call, it's actually a dancing man, dancing person there, and that's kind of what we call the recreation, those other enriching experiences. And then in 2022, we're also looking at this through the lens of making the system more equitable. And so that icon on the right of the slide is an equity slide, and we'll be working some outcomes, indicators, and metrics to help define all of these. And then we look at ways in which we can, as a state, but also with help from all of our partners, because it is a shared responsibility across all aspects of government, how we can potentially fund these management actions over the next 30 years. As mentioned before, not necessarily saying we need to fund this project, this project, this project, but the types of management actions that can be implemented to help improve the system. Next slide, please. And one more, please. Okay, so moving on to the 2022 update. This is the second update of the CVFPP. So we're currently updating the body of work produced from 2017 with new information. The end result, as we come out in the kind of fall of 2022, will be an update that has updated investment needs and recommendations to help continue implementation of the state system-wide investment approach over the next 30 years. While the broad strategies and concepts of that state system-wide investment approach have not changed across the planning process, but in the context of this iterative planning process, refinements of that vision may be made, and changes, as changes happen to the flood system and some of the complex variables that we all deal with on a daily basis become better understood. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, we're focusing on 3 themes in this update. We look at the innovation expressed through climate change adaptation. What are some of those? What are the effects of climate change, and how is it going to affect our flood management system? And what are some of those mitigation efforts that we can put forth to help mitigate the effects of this climate change? Additionally, we're building on 2017's performance tracking development effort in the update to continue to bolster the outcomes, indicators, and metrics that we as flood managers are striving towards to help some of those societal benefits, those public health and safety, the economy, the ecosystem, and looking at ways to track performance as a means of making sure we are implementing things effectively and becoming more accountable to the taxpayers, or continue to be accountable to taxpayers. Additionally, the other one is collaborating with other state planning efforts, making sure that the department is aligning and planning and implementing in a collaborative fashion so we can continue to build and become more effective. Next slide, please. So this just highlights kind of what I talked about before, how we've gone from the 2012 plan to an update in 2017, moving towards this 2022 update. And as you can see, it's just a little bit more of a pulled forward. We're refining the SSI, we're updating those flood policy issues from 2017, and then focusing on those 3 themes, as well as some other pieces that you'll see on a kind of a update by update basis. Next slide, please. So diving into the working draft itself, if you're familiar with the 2020 or 2017 update, it is consistent in the fact that it is 4 chapters. The chapters have been massaged a little bit to the types of content, but for basically chapter 1 is that introduction and setting the stage chapter. Chapter 2 is going to be looking at the various progress that we've made from implementation to policy issue development to some of the climate change type work that we've done. So basically a look back of what we've been able to accomplish since 2017. And then we move into chapter 3, which is saying, okay, what do we need to do? How do we need to continue implementing? What are some of those risks, and how have they changed in the last 5 years? And then what are those priorities moving forward? And then chapter 4 is the implementation side of it. Now we've in chapter 3, we get an understanding of what the portfolio is, what some of those updated priorities are. And then chapter 4, we lay out the implementation over the next 30 years. A couple things that are new this time around. We have we're calling it call to action infographic. You won't necessarily see that yet. It's still being developed and will continue to be developed over the public process further into 2022. That call to action will be a 2-page, really upfront. This is what we need right now. These are the types of things, kind of really pulling the bullet points from the document forward and saying these are the types of actions we need right now. Additionally, we are working through our partnerships with what we call our regional flood management planning groups. We're working with them. That's our main tie into the locals in this process, and the local stakeholders. And we're giving them some real estate in between chapters 2 and 3 to provide a regional spotlight for each of the regions. There's 3 regions in the Sacramento River Basin and 3 regions in the San Joaquin River Basin. And so they will be providing us information. And that information you'll see in the public draft coming out in a couple months. Next slide, please. So chapter 1, builds on, it sets the stage. Some of the highlights: the CVFPP updates are consistent with previous plans. We aren't creating a new plan, we are updating previous plans. And then building on the outcome-based performance tracking effort from 2017, the 22 update will continue progressing towards tracking performance of planned investments towards an aligned set of intended outcomes, including other benefits that could be achieved developing multi-benefit projects. Additionally, updating the SSIA to provide a portfolio that is reasonable, balanced, and cost-effective, using information from not only the regional flood management planning effort that I just mentioned, but also gathering information from the DWR implementation programs to put together a well-balanced portfolio. The narrative you'll see in chapter 1 is that in spite of all the investments that have been made, flood risk remains high, native species continue to decline in a lot of areas. A lot of this is going to be accelerated by projected growth and climate change, unless we improve and speed up the pace of our implementation actions. Next slide, please. So chapter 2, I mentioned, is that looking back piece. And some of the highlights from that chapter are, it's going to be talking about implementation progress over the past 5 years. What are the structural, non-structural improvements that have made into the system? And those improvements are broken into these 4 buckets, which we used in 2017. We break it into system-wide improvements, urban, rural, and then small communities. Additionally, we're going to be looking at the progress implementation for some of the policy issues that we developed in 2017. We're going to look at the work that's being done on the performance tracking framework. We're going to we've been refining our understanding of the effects of climate change through our flood management system. We'll talk about the work that's in chapter 2 that's been done to date on that piece. And then developing and strengthening of our partnerships. We're working hard with locals to try to move a lot of these improvements and implementation efforts forward. We'll have a spotlight on not only the Yola Bypass Partnership, but also the San Joaquin Flood Management, Regional Flood Management Strategy in that chapter. Next slide, please. This slide is just a kind of a bridge between chapters 2 and 3. So chapter 2 focused on those completed actions. The map on the left are dots with some of the completed actions that have occurred between 2017 and 2022. And then as we slide into chapter 3, we're talking about what are those things that need to be done? What are those in progress or planned actions in the systems? Next slide, please. Trying to go through it quick because I know Heidi's got some stuff she wants to touch on. So chapter 3, that's that looking forward chapter. In what you'll see in there are the technical analysis results. We have a refined climate change analysis. We have new tools for looking at life loss and damages that we're using. And so you'll see some results in chapter 3 that highlight those. Additionally, you'll get that updated portfolio information based on the information gathering that was done through the RFMPs and the DWR programs. We spotlight regional efforts similarly to chapter 2. We look at what's going to be happening in the future in the Yola Bypass cash flow area, or with the San Joaquin Regional Flood Management Strategy. We call it 25.4 to match the water resiliency portfolio action. Also, we're going to look at how we're going to continue development of outcomes, indicators, and metrics for tracking and performance, as well as the way we can start implementing this framework, not only at the state level, but also at the local and federal level. And then we'll have a list of kind of what we're calling our high priority list of policy recommendations in chapter 3. This will not encapsulate all of the recommendations that we've received, but it will be kind of that higher priority list of things that we need to implement in the next 5 years. The rest of the recommendations will be included as an appendix for people to be able to pull in and take a look and say, okay, these are ones we need to focus on in our region. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview. These are on the left side of the plus sign are the 8 policy issues that were developed in 2017. And these were highlighted as things that provide impediments to implementation. On the left side, those are being moved forward in 2022. And as well as on the right side of the plus sign are two new policy issues that are moving up in priority: climate change and flood resilience, and then also equity. And these are both policy issues that kind of umbrella over the top of all the rest of the policy issues. So we're working on developing content for those currently, and everyone will have a chance to comment on that in the public review draft. Next slide, please. So chapter 4, it's the moving forward, that implementation chapter. You're going to get that updated need information, that portfolio information and associated costs with it, as well as historical expenditures across federal, state, and local sources. And that information is being used to help define what the funding plan will be moving forward for over the next 30 years. That'll be broken into 3 10-year phases, and it'll be based on the types of management actions that need to be implemented across various phases. What you'll see on the slide is there's $25 to $30 billion price tag. So that's an updated number from 2017 as locals have refined their understanding of their systems. They've been able to put some costs to projects that may not have had costs previously. We've updated the costs from 2017 dollars to 2021 dollars. And so there's various reasons that number is increasing. And so you'll see that information in chapter 4. Next slide, please. There are several component efforts that are running in parallel to the 22 CVFPP update development. Conservation strategy, which Heidi is going to talk about here in a minute or two. We have some investment strategy work. There'll be no standalone documents to that. That information that came out of the investment strategy effort will be in chapter 4. The regional flood management planning group work that we've talked about, I highlighted earlier. We also have 2 DWR-led efforts. One, the flood system status report, as well as the SPFC descriptive document, which are both documents that describe the system itself, what efforts have been made to maintain the system, and all those types of activities within the flood system itself. We did a few technical analyses, including a refined climate change. We looked at addressing the life loss and exposure type information. For a performance tracking technical memorandum that's being developed to help reinforce some of the information that you'll see in the documentation or in the plan itself, as well as we're performing a Delta plan consistency determination. From a CEQA perspective, the content and refinements in this update do not include actions that would result in a new or increased significant impacts to the environment. So we've come to the conclusion that we'll just be doing an addendum to our previous CEQA documentation. Next slide, please, my last slide. And so this is where we are in the process. We are currently working, we put out a working draft in October, received a bunch of, for some of the stakeholders that have been engaged with us, received a considerable amount of comments, have been addressing those, and are working on putting out a public draft of the update itself in the February-March timeframe, Q1 as we're calling it, of 2022. The next row down, you'll see, and Heidi will probably highlight this, that conservation strategy public draft came out at towards the end of 2021, and that adopted version will come out at the same time as the update in 2022 Q3, and then a final CEQA addendum will come out at the same time. So that ends my part of the presentation. So now I'd like to hand it over to Heidi.
Thanks, Jason.
You're welcome.
Here I am. Can you all see me? Hear me? Okay. And thanks, Uri. For the opportunity to talk about the conservation strategy. And as you've seen, Jason did have an opportunity to sort of introduce the idea of what the conservation strategy is as well. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, what we're going to be covering here are the highlights of the conservation strategy update. So we're going to talk about the 2022 version that is in process right now, along with the CVFPP. Look at the primary components of the main document and the 8 technical appendices. Want to talk about our new focus on climate change adaptation, which is in our Appendix H. and do a small introduction to EcoFIP for the conservation strategy and LunchMAR and how the integration and partnership is going to work there. We'll briefly go over the schedule, and then I'll recap the key points of the presentation, and we'll have a time for questions and discussion. Okay, next slide. So the primary components of the update is that it does incorporate, we keep the main document is the same as it was in 2016, but we've incorporated new science and information in all of the elements. It does identify impediments to the multi-benefit project implementation. Okay, someone's saying that what they're seeing online doesn't correspond with what's shown online. That might be an old chat. I'm going to not ignore the chat and let someone, let Ori tell me if I need to do something differently. So it identifies impediments to multi-benefit project implementation. And this is something that we focused on by getting input from a number of stakeholders to see how this is working. So it details our multi-benefit project funding sources, describes regulatory compliance, and describes the development and integration of recommendations and priority actions. And this is a big piece of this update. We're also providing information on adaptive management and performance tracking. And then we do a short report out on the multi-benefit project implementation that we've seen so far. That, of course, is the ultimate goal of our conservation strategy, is to be a toolkit for more multi-benefit projects across the landscape. Next slide. So just briefly, the technical appendices of the CS are really, in terms of size and volume, the bulk of the conservation strategy, and where a lot of the details are that some folks with a particular interest may want to go and look. The first, Appendix A, is the target species list review and update, and the focused conservation plans on Delta smelt, tricolored blackbird, and the chat. Appendix C is the updates to the 2016 strategy, Appendix J, and updates. D is updates to the strategy, Appendix A. So these are just updates from the main document, and so they've changed appendix names, so just FYI there. Appendix E is mitigation availability. F is the 5-year implementation summary. And G and H are pretty critical parts of the conservation strategy. G is the advisory committee recommendations. These came from many, many months of conversations and review of an earlier version of the strategy, and came up with recommendations for how to move forward. And so you can see the full list of all the recommendations made during that process. And then H is our new appendix, and it is our climate change adaptation strategy. So just as the CVFPP is taking a new look at climate and deeper look into climate change, the conservation strategy as well is reviewing climate change and its specific impact on ecosystems and habitats. So that's going to be a more focused piece for the conservation strategy. Okay, next slide, please. So going into Appendix H a little bit deeper, in this appendix, we're using current climate modeling data to estimate impacts to the conservation strategy objectives and target species. It's considering the ecological, habitat, and specific species responses, identifies preliminary adaptation strategies and methods for increasing resiliency. And obviously, this is just the beginning. We'll be needing to do a lot more of that as we go forward. It identifies the data gaps and additional tools or analyses that could be used to inform development of adaptation strategies. And it's going to describe how the conservation strategy specific adaptation approaches will inform the development and implementation of multi-benefit projects. We're going to have to obviously take all of this new news about climate change into the development of multi-benefit projects and their implementation. Okay, next slide. So the next two graphics, this one and the next one, are a way to see the major changes that we expect from the changing climate. And they're focused on 3 general categories: changes in precipitation, changes in temperature, and watershed response. So you can see there most of what you would expect if you're following climate change. We're finding similar issues here. Warmer average air temperatures, greater and more frequent extreme heat intensity, higher water temperature, increased potential evapotranspiration. And then with the changes of precipitation, greater percentage of precipitation is rain, less is snow, change in seasonality, so when and how that comes down, greater frequency and magnitude of the atmospheric rivers, and increase in precipitation intensity. And then in terms of the watershed response, we are looking at reduced spring snowpack and snowmelt volume, earlier, more rapid spring snowmelt, increased winter runoff volumes with higher peak winter runoff, more frequent and intense droughts, increased evapotranspiration, sea level rise, and more frequent and intense wildfires. So all of these are going to be, we're going to have to be taking into account with our projects, multi-benefit projects. Next slide, please. So another way to see the impacts are through the climate stressors and the resiliency measures that we have identified so far. And again, this is a beginning, and we're going to be needing to do more on that as well. And you can see here that when you look at the resiliency, well, the stressors, increased flooding, much of what we talked about already, increased pumping due to agricultural water deficit, post-fire erosion and flooding. I'll let you read through those. The resiliency measures include things like levee setbacks and relocation, riparian planting and vegetation enhancement, flood managed aquifer recharge. So you can see here that the links to EcoFIP and LunchMAR are significant, that we're going to be wanting to use the LunchMAR as ways to implement some of our conservation strategy goals as well. Okay, next slide, please. So the Appendix H conclusions, just move my box out of the way. The conservation strategy cited the approximate 95% loss of riparian habitat in the Central Valley and the stressors that exacerbate conditions for native habitat and species. And so this is important to note that what we're looking at through the conservation strategies is to not just mitigate that loss, but increase more habitat. So the conclusions include that the current and potential changes to temperature, precipitation, and hydrology will fundamentally affect the ecological processes, habitats, and species in the Central Valley, that the specific impacts and responses of particular natural community or species to these changes will vary, obviously depending on the specific habitat needs and life history requirements, as well as the health of the ecosystem. And all of these things, again, will have to be taken into account as we formulate multi-benefit projects. Overall, climate change alterations add further stress and risk of decline or extirpation for the native species. So not a lot of good news there. Next slide, please. They continue with, obviously, that continues to is critical to build resilience by restoring ecological, hydrological, and geomorphic processes at a rate that can counteract the stressors. We need to implement resiliency building adaptation measures and actions and increase the pace of multi-benefit project implementation. That's a key. The conservation strategy provides the requisite guidance to make progress on developing these projects to increase system resiliency. And again, the main challenge that we face in relation to climate change is primarily the one of timing. That getting multi-benefit projects implemented has proved to be difficult. There are a lot of obstacles and barriers that we need to overcome, and we're going to need to increase that pace to increase our resiliency. Next slide. So this is where EcoFIP and LunchMAR, the LunchMAR pilot. Sorry, my screen is messing up. Component to the conservation strategy. So we updated the EcoFIP component due to the climate change analysis, and we're looking at the LunchMAR pilot study as an extra step for opportunities to inundate. So it provides for systematic approach to evaluate opportunities for multi-benefit flood management projects and groundwater recharge potential through floodplain connectivity, the salmonid habitat suitability, climate resiliency implications, future management scenarios, and landscape applicability. Next slide. It updates the floodplain inundation potential portion of the floodplain of the FROA analysis to address ecosystem processing data gaps, as we identified back in the 2016 conservation strategy, and evaluates potential for floodplain restoration by levee setback or topographic modification at multiple spatial and temporal scales. We're looking at floodplain inundation, salmonid habitat suitability, floodplain recharge, and topographic modification. So we're looking to start this as a broad landscape scale and then become more focused as we move along. And right now, the pilot study is focused on the San Joaquin Basin. And next slide, please. This is just a graphic to sort of show in another way that we're starting at the top, large scale inundation potential, starting to look at multi-objective site identification and prioritization, and then come up with a number of pilot studies as we get more specific. And I want to just pause for a moment here to see if Jenny or Michael have anything to add on EcoFIP.
Thanks, Heidi. This is Jenny. I would just probably add that, folks on this call are aware of the LunchMAR Research Advisory Committee that was convened a few years ago. And one of the subcommittees as part of the RAC was on kind of environmental issues or opportunities related to LunchMAR. And floodplain recharge came out as an important area for research for that subcommittee. And so this work is really tied to those recommendations that came out of the Research Advisory Committee. And at least from the LunchMAR team's perspective, we are really excited about this opportunity to partner with the conservation strategy and really progress this concept of floodplain recharge and what opportunities exist out there. So, I just wanted to say thanks and connect it to some past work that this group is likely familiar with.
Great, thank you very much, Jenny. And we are also excited about this opportunity to partner. I think what we'll find is that much of the implementation of the conservation strategy is going to be dependent upon partnerships and collaborations like this one. It's a big job, and the document itself is a guidance, but the actual implementation on the ground will have to come from these additional collaborations. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate the schedule, you saw the graphic that Jason shared. So the public draft of the strategy was released on December 10th. And there's a link there where you can, on the DWR's website, where you can go in and see the actual document as well as all of the appendices. We are asking comments due on February 10th. And on the website, you will also find a form that we've provided and ask you to use to provide comments, makes it easier for us to track them. And then the final document will be released with the CVFPP update in the fourth quarter of 2022. And as you heard from Jenny, and we discussed briefly, the EcoFIP FloodMAR study is ongoing. So that will be a slightly separate process. Next slide. So I just want to wrap up with the key points of our presentation. Is that the conservation strategy update and the supporting documents was developed with a focus on implementing the multi-benefit projects. What we've done is researched and developed relevant scientific information and kept it updated through this update, and we'll continue to do that in future updates. It's imperative that we continue to collaborate and leverage other programs and efforts. We are also implementing, separate from the CVFPP, a tracking and reporting to track and report progress on our measurable objectives so that we can see that we are not just implementing more multi-benefit projects, but actually adding habitat to the system. And then it's probably providing a forum for advancing conservation strategy goals overall. Next slide. And that's it for our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks Heidi, and thanks Jason. And Jenny, I know you were going to look through the chat for questions. I don't see anything, but maybe participants want to raise a hand and ask or provide comments. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on the presentation.
I just see a comment pop up from Abdul.
There you
It's
go.
a doozy. So I don't know, Abdul, if you want to unmute yourself and share your comment. I can read it, but I know
Yes,
nobody action.
thank you, Jenny. And first, thank you, Jason and Heidi. I think I really enjoyed because the summaries were, on point and very easy to follow and understand. So really want to thank you on that. But I have a big philosophical question for Jason, you, Heidi, and others who are working on CVFPP. And the reason I asked this question because in all the projects I'm currently personally involved in, I am actually experiencing this thing, what I call, so I'll read the question. As you are completing CVFPP 2022, could you please share with us one or two big paradigm shifts that you and your team may have experienced during this process in terms of one of the three things: how we approach the planning process, or how we conduct the required analysis, or the last one, I think probably I'd be really happy if you respond to that, and how we prioritize actions for implementation. Thank you.
I knew when I saw Abdul's name come up, it was going to be a doozy. I'm trying to think, like, as far as a paradigm shift, I'm not sure if we have a paradigm shift and a wholesale kind of change type situation as far as our planning goes. But I feel like with each successive planning cycle, we gain, and when the royal we at the DWR, we in the flood management community continue to gain a better understanding of the need to make sure we are working with all aspects of water when we're working within the flood management system, because the flood management system shares, water supply space, shares, the need for water quality issues, especially when we're talking about, flood after fire areas. So I think it's just a complexity that continues to be added, and it's needed to be added, that we can't just build a bunch of really tall levees and concrete line every channel and push the water out. We need to work within the confines of the societal values that we're developing to look at the various aspects of water with respects to how we're protecting people from flooding, but balancing that with how we need to but reverse some of the effects on our environment and build the environment, the ecosystems back up. So I think it's just that complexity that from a planning perspective just adds a little bit of layer of challenge to each successive update. As far as how we prioritize actions for implementation, the CVFPP doesn't actually, I'll just kind of note that, I have to note that CVFPP does not prioritize specific actions for implementations. It looks at a portfolio of management action categories of things pulled from the actions that we receive from the locals and the DWR programs, but we don't actually prioritize actions. Now, that being said, my hope is that as we continue to develop this performance tracking system and we gain a better understanding and a coalescence around the outcomes that we as flood and water managers need to achieve towards public safety, towards the environment, that will over time become the way in which we begin to prioritize our implementation actions, driving towards types of outcomes that we want to achieve rather than we need to just build a levee here or we need to do a setback here, or what are the actual outcomes, and focusing on the way that we do those, which would be quite a paradigm shift of how we prioritize implementation. That's all I have. Jenny?
Thanks, Jason. Was that Abdul? Were you following up? Okay.
No, I just want to thank Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Abdul, for the question. And I think, just from, also having the pleasure of working on the CVFPP and the FLEDMAR program, I think the three themes of the plan really, are part of that paradigm shift. That, we're looking at performance tracking to really progress accountability and adaptive management. We're looking at climate change because there's real urgency here. The document needs to support implementation in a way that reflects that climate change is beating us right now. They're out ahead, or climate change is out ahead. It's outpacing our ability to adapt, respond, and implement projects. And so really supporting, understanding that vulnerability and supporting implementation of projects moving forward. And in that aligned and collaborative way, if we really want to implement meaningful benefit, multi-benefit projects, collaboration is the key, and moving forward in partnership. And with kind of that multi-benefit lens, I see Aisha had a question, Jason or Heidi, this could be answered by one or both of you, about what the definition of multi-benefit projects is within the conservation strategy and CVFPP world.
So I can jump in here briefly and invite others to add on. This is actually been the topic of a lot of conversation. So it's not something that we can answer easily. We've batted around a number of different definitions that everyone can agree on, and it's been somewhat difficult. I will tell you that from the conservation strategy perspective, ultimately what we want to see is increased habitat throughout the system. So when you look back at the fact that we've already lost 95% of riparian habitat, what we want to see is that multi-benefit projects have incorporated in their flood management work how they can preserve the existing habitat and increase the amount of habitat, if possible, through a number of different ways. We know there are ways to do that. We're looking for additional creativity there. And in order to do that, just to refer back to the previous question as well, I think we would say that the paradigm shift we want to see happen is that ecosystem and habitat increase, whether you call it uplift or add-on, or it's more than mitigation, that becomes part of and parcel of all planning processes. And again, as Jason said, it's not necessarily just us doing it. It has to cross all different agencies and implementing agencies and local organizations, so that we see uplift and added on habitat incorporated from the planning part of the process all the way through to projects, as many as possible and as effectively as possible.
And so just real quick, I would add that the definition as it currently exists for multi-benefit in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, paraphrasing, is flood, focused with ecosystem benefits, as part of the system, as well as other benefits that can be achieved as feasible type of thing. That being said, we are consistently developing and improving the way we are looking, as I mentioned before, how that the flood management system and the water management system need to coexist and need to work together. And there are a lot of benefits from FLEDMAR and recharge that we're finding through the efforts of Jenny and this group that can provide that flood benefit and are potentially important to help mitigate some of those climate change effects. And so right now the definition is prescribed in the CVFPP, but I know other DWR efforts, it is a different definition. So there definitely still needs to be some work on aligning those. So I see Aisha has her hand up.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I have been involved in the CVFPP, or at least the conservation strategy to some degree. And I just raised this point because, you know, the term multi-benefit can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. And so as we move forward in this kind of, you know, new paradigm of multi-benefit, I think it's really important for us to define what that means. In the conservation strategy, at least from the environmental community, I think it's really important that at least two conditions need to be met in order to be considered multi-benefit. One is flood, you know, in a flood, you know, the CVFPP conservation strategy context. One is flood risk reduction, and the other is ecosystem improvement. So those are the two. Any other benefits are great, but if it's just flood risk reduction and subsidence prevention, for instance, that is not considered multi-benefit under the CVFPP. Or, you know, if it's just ecosystem habitat and open space access, that is not considered multi-benefit projects under the CVFPP. So I guess I'm just kind of bringing that up because we are starting to think about multi-benefit recharge projects and what that means. And it doesn't just mean that there's two benefits. It means that there has to be a minimum of a certain, you know, I don't think we've defined it yet. So and I just want to kind of, if other folks are not aware of this already in the LunchMAR community, just kind of introduce this concept, and that multi-benefit framework in the flood world has been a long discussion for many, many years. And it's, you know, sounds simple, but it hasn't been simple, and it's, you know, still evolving. And so I think we as a community, you know, on the LunchMAR side should also think about that and what that means to us. And also, you know, not only that, but how do we kind of integrate that with the CVFPP, right? So if we want to really start integrating, we want to make sure that our multi-benefit, you know, in the LunchMAR side aligns well with the CVFPP multi-benefit, so that we can really combine goals.
Thank you for that context and that discussion, Aisha. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It seems like this could be a separate whole LunchMAR discussion. And so there is probably time for one more question, and this one's for Heidi. Are there quantitative goals for increasing habitat in the Central Valley?
Oh, we do not have quantitative goals right now. I think, you know, I'm going to ask David to jump in here, or Dave Martagian. We don't have quantitative goals. Let me let David answer this one. This is a tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for certain habitat types, we have, you know, acres of habitat that, you know, acres of riparian habitat or shaded, or miles of river, shaded riverine aquatic that we have in there. We also have, you know, some things that are a little more abstract, like you know, geomorphic processes and things like that. But our measurable objectives do have some sort of quantitative measure to them. Hopefully that helps.
Per measurable objective.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think it would be really helpful to connect some projects that are being considered in the Central Valley and to the conservation strategy, and see how LunchMAR projects might be able to help achieve conservation strategy goals. And I know you know, part of that is the work that we're doing in the floodplain recharge, you know, EcoFIP LunchMAR work. So I think it'd be a great reference for LunchMAR folks who are looking to implement projects in the Central Valley to see how it can align to the measurable objectives in the conservation strategy.
And can I add on? Thanks, Jenny and David. Let me just had a minute to think through this, because I think part of the issue with quantitative goals is that we get lost in the conversation about how to do the measurement. And that has been part of the process as we set or try to set quantitative goals. How do we define each of the things that we're wanting to count? number one. And number two, how do we actually count it? So how do we define increased habitat? How do we define the species, the recovery of species, and how do we link that increase to the measures that came out of the conservation strategies and multi-benefit projects that are on the ground? So I think we have good goals about measuring and potentially some kind of accountability for reaching those goals, but we have a lot of work to do to figure out how we measure it, how we count it, how we agree on what we're counting. And so I didn't want to leave that with, no, we don't have goals. We do. We're just, we're working on those.
Thanks, Heidi. Maybe time for another quick question. I think the clock just changed to 1:29. Anything else out there that people would like to bring up for Jason and Heidi?
Yes, for all of us, I'd like to bring up, if you have not seen, please see Don't Look Up, the movie. It's an amazing movie. And when Heidi was talking about that, how do we express, how do we relate, how do you communicate the urgency about we have to do things now, not later? This movie, I think, in a cinematic fashion, at least it impacted my mind that things need to be done much quicker than we think we should.
Thanks, Abdul.
Thank you.
That was a good one.
Well, a
Great.
virtual round of applause for Jason and Heidi. Thanks for the great presentations and helping us put some flood in LunchMAR. And as always, everybody, thanks for joining. And if you've got topics that you would like to see at future LunchMARs or would like to volunteer for an upcoming webinar, just let me know in chat or via email. So happy January, happy New Year, and looking forward to a 2022 full of LunchMARs.
Thanks for having us.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Jason.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
So, usually we stay on to chat a little bit, but I actually have to switch to another meeting.
All right.
So I'm sorry to be the one to turn it off. It was really great to hear your presentation and about your work.
See,
Oh, thank you.
Jenny
See
still
y'all.
has the holiday lights up.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
they stay up for January. It's a Swedish
Yeah.
thing. Keep the light on when it's dark out.
There you go.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
all.